July 14, 1945. The gray morning mist drifted over the Alaskan harbor like a ghost that had lost its way. The sea was half ice, half smoke. A rusted transport vessel moaned against the dock, its metal ribs groaning as though even the ship wanted to forget the war. The gangplank dropped with a hollow clang, and from the belly of the vessel stepped a line of thin, weary figures, Japanese women prisoners of war, wrapped in torn military coats that did little to fight the wind. Their eyes squinted against the pale glare of the Alaskan sun, blinking rapidly as if the light itself were an interrogation. The first to step forward was Nurse Aiko Sato, once a medic at a field hospital near Saipan. She had not smiled in months. Her hand trembled around a single possession, a rosary made from fishing twine. Behind her shuffled Reiko Tanaka, the quiet one who had lost her brother at sea and now carried his folded photograph in her pocket. None of them spoke. They had been told they were being sent to a place of labor, somewhere in the northern wilderness of America. What they hadn't been told was that Alaska could make even the strongest man feel small. The dock creaked beneath their boots. Around them, American soldiers in thick parkas and fur caps barked orders in a language that cut like stone. Yet the tone was oddly gentle. One of the guards, Sergeant Daniel Hayes, raised his hand not in command but in greeting. His breath made clouds in the cold air. The women exchanged uncertain glances. They had heard stories. Americans were said to be giants who drank the blood of their prisoners, who built cities out of fire. But the man before them, though broad as an ox, had kind eyes. He reached down to help a stumbling prisoner and simply said, "Careful, miss." The translator hesitated to repeat the word miss, unsure if it was mockery or respect. Aiko looked up at him and for a moment, against her will, felt something strange, confusion rather than fear. The march to the camp took half a day. Snow still lingered even though it was summer. The path wound through forests that seemed endless, black trunks rising like pillars into the fog. The sound of axes echoed somewhere far ahead, deep and rhythmic, like a heart beating in the distance. The women walked silently, their breath visible in pale bursts. Reiko stumbled once and muttered, "The trees here are too tall. Even the sky hides behind them." Aiko didn't answer. She was listening, to the distant thud of wood splitting, to the gruff laughter carried on the wind. It didn't sound like soldiers. It sounded like workmen, the kind her father once was. When they reached the clearing, the women stopped in disbelief. The camp was not a prison of barbed wire and mud as they'd imagined. Instead, it looked like a frontier outpost. Timber cabins, sawdust-covered paths, smoke rising from chimneys and men, towering men, moving among the trees. Each swung an axe the size of a rifle. Muscles rippled beneath plaid shirts. Beards were frosted with snow. One man hoisted a log that looked heavy enough to crush a car. Another laughed as he carried two at once. The interpreter gasped under his breath, These are lumberjacks." The women had no translation for that word, but the image spoke for itself. Aiko's eyes widened as one of them turned toward her. His shoulders looked wider than a doorframe. He smiled faintly, his teeth bright against the gray. She murmured in Japanese, "That's not a man, that's a giant." The camp commandant, Lieutenant Robert Mercer, appeared from a cabin doorway, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. "Welcome to Camp Wrangell," he said through the interpreter. "You'll work in the textile shed and the kitchen. You'll be treated fairly if you follow the rules." His voice was calm, neither cruel nor kind, just matter-of-fact. Behind him, the lumberjacks kept working, barely glancing at the new arrivals. The sound of saws roared like engines. To the Japanese women, it felt like standing at the edge of another world, one where strength itself had a different language. That first evening, Aiko was assigned to help prepare bread in the mess hall. She had never seen flour so white or ovens so large. The Americans moved around her efficiently but not impatiently. When one of them, a tall red-bearded man named Bill Hargrove, noticed her struggling to lift a sack of wheat, he walked over and picked it up as if it were a feather. "Don't strain yourself," he said, motioning gently. She stiffened, unsure whether it was an order. He chuckled softly. "You'll tear your arms off before that bag gives way." The translator tried to explain, but Aiko already understood his tone. It wasn't mockery. It was teasing, the kind you give to someone you don't see as a threat. It was almost human. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the walls like loose drums. The lumberjacks gathered by a bonfire, their laughter rolling through the forest. The women, confined to their barracks, listened. Reiko whispered, "They laugh so easily. Don't they know there was a war?" Aiko didn't answer. She was staring at her hands, still warm from the oven, still smelling faintly of bread. Somewhere inside her, an unfamiliar thought took shape. Perhaps these men did not see them as enemies at all. That night, as the generator lights flickered, Aiko couldn't sleep. The barack was cold, the air thick with the smell of pine. From her bunk, she could see out through a small frost-covered window. In the distance, a single figure stood at the edge of the forest, sharpening his axe under the moonlight. His size dwarfed the trees around him. He paused for a moment as if sensing her gaze and looked toward the barack. Even from that distance, she could see the faint glow of his cigarette. He exhaled a trail of smoke that drifted upward like incense. She quickly turned away, heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. In the morning, they were roused early by the clang of a bell. The lumberjacks were already working before dawn, their silhouettes moving against the fog. The women were led to the sewing shed, a long wooden building that smelled of oil and fabric. Their job was to stitch work gloves for the men, using thick canvas and leather scraps. It was hard, tedious work, but it was warmer than the cold outside. Every few hours, one of the lumberjacks would appear at the door, covered in sawdust, to collect new gloves. Each time, the women fell silent, their eyes fixed on their tables. The men's sheer size filled the doorway like an eclipse. One afternoon, as Aiko reached to hand a bundle of finished gloves to Sergeant Hayes, their fingers brushed for a brief second. His hand was warm, rough, and enormous compared to hers. She froze, instinctively pulling back. He noticed her fear and gave a small nod before walking out. It was nothing, just a moment, but it left her shaken. For months, every human touch she'd known had been from soldiers or doctors treating wounds. This was different. It wasn't dominance. It was acknowledgement. That evening, Reiko asked quietly, "Do you think they hate us?" Aiko stared at the floorboards before answering, "I think they don't know what to do with us." The words surprised even her. There was no malice in them, only uncertainty. Outside, the axes kept swinging, the forest echoing like a drumbeat that refused to end. By the third day, the women began to sense a strange order in this place. The men worked, they ate, they laughed, they slept. No shouting, no punishment, no executions. It was still captivity, but it didn't feel like the prisons they had imagined. They were surrounded by men strong enough to crush them, yet no one raised a hand. And that, somehow, was more unsettling than cruelty. As the sun set over the horizon that night, a faint orange glow spilled through the windows. The mountains stood like ancient guards, silent and immovable. Aiko sat on her bunk, whispering a prayer she had long forgotten. Reiko was already asleep, clutching her brother's photograph. Outside, the giants of the forest returned from their day's labor, boots heavy with mud, shoulders steaming with sweat. One of them, perhaps Hargrove, glanced at the women's barack and tipped his cap before vanishing into the mist. For the first time since leaving Japan, Aiko didn't feel the urge to cry. She didn't know if that was strength or surrender. But deep inside, something had begun to change. She just didn't know yet that this strange, frozen land would soon turn every belief she had about war, and about humanity, upside down. The morning light in Alaska was deceptive. It looked soft, almost forgiving, yet its cold could bite through wool. Aiko stood outside the textile shed with her scarf wrapped tight, watching the lumberjacks work. It was the first week of August 1945, and the air smelled of resin and smoke. The men moved with a rhythm that seemed ancient, as if they had been born swinging axes. Each thud of steel into wood was followed by a pause, a grunt, and another strike. The pattern became a kind of heartbeat for the camp. She noticed how they barely spoke while they worked. Communication passed in nods, gestures, and laughter that seemed to come from the chest rather than the mouth. There was something unshakable in them, like they belonged to the land itself. Sergeant Hayes was different from the others. He wasn't the tallest nor the loudest, but he carried a quiet steadiness that drew respect. A veteran of the Aleutian campaign, he had seen what war did to men, how it hollowed them out from the inside. Perhaps that was why he looked at the Japanese prisoners not with hatred, but with the detached curiosity of someone too tired to hate anymore. When Aiko worked in the sewing shed, she sometimes saw him through the window, leaning against the fence, smoking and watching the mountains as though he were waiting for them to speak. Reiko, ever the cautious one, whispered one evening, "They watch us like we are animals in a zoo." Aiko shook her head. "No," she said softly, "they watch us like we're ghosts." Reiko frowned. "What's the difference?" Aiko didn't answer. She was thinking about the lumberjack with the red beard, the one called Hargrove, who always carried 2 axes as if one weren't enough. Every time he passed the barrack, he tipped his cap. She didn't know why that small act unsettled her so deeply. The work grew harder as the days passed. The women were expected to mend torn uniforms, patch gloves, and keep the laundry for over 40 men. Their hands blistered, their backs ached, but the food was plentiful. Bowls of stew, thick bread, coffee so strong it burned the tongue. None of them could reconcile the generosity with the enemy they had imagined. The first time Aiko tasted the stew, she wept quietly. It reminded her of her mother's soup from Kyoto before the bombings. Reiko saw her tears and pretended not to notice. By mid-August, the lumberjacks began preparing for the fall season's heaviest work, clearing trees before the snow set in. The prisoners were ordered to assist by sorting ropes and oiling saws. It was the first time Aiko saw them up close outside the mess hall. The men were immense, their shirts rolled up, arms like carved wood. One man laughed as he lifted a log heavier than a horse, the muscles in his neck bulging like ropes. The sound of splitting timber was deafening. Reiko muttered, "They could crush us without effort." Aiko nodded but kept watching. When Hayes caught her staring, he gave a wry smile. "They look like bears, don't they?" he said to the interpreter, who translated hesitantly. Aiko hesitated, then replied, "Not bears. Mountains that walk." The interpreter relayed her words, and Hayes let out a low chuckle. "Fair enough," he said. The moment passed, but something changed in the air between them. An invisible bridge, built not from words but from understanding. Later that week, an accident broke the camp's calm rhythm. One of the saw blades snapped mid-cut, sending metal shards flying. A small fire erupted from the sparks, spreading through the dry sawdust before anyone could react. Chaos followed. The Japanese women were ordered to evacuate the shed, but Aiko froze when she saw Hargrove trapped beneath a fallen beam. Without thinking, she ran toward him, her boots slipping in the debris. The others screamed at her to stop, but she crawled under the smoke and grabbed his arm. The beam was impossibly heavy. Then Hayes appeared beside her, face blackened with soot, shouting for help. Together, with 2 more men, they heaved the beam aside. Hargrove coughed and stumbled free, blood trickling down his temple. He looked at Aiko with disbelief, as if trying to understand why she had risked herself for him. That night, after the fire was contained, Hayes approached the barrack. He removed his cap as he spoke through the interpreter. "The foreman says your quick thinking saved Hargrove's life." Aiko stood silently, unsure how to respond. "He wanted to say thank you," Hayes continued. "And he wanted to send you this." He handed her a small piece of whittled wood, an animal carved crudely from pine. It looked like a fox. The carving was rough but sincere. Aiko took it, her fingers trembling. She bowed slightly, murmuring a word that needed no translation. Hayes watched her for a moment, then walked away. The next morning the atmosphere in the camp had changed. The men who once ignored the prisoners now nodded when passing by. One even offered Reiko a piece of candy, which she refused out of pride but secretly pocketed. The guards seemed less rigid, the laughter around the fire louder. Aiko felt the tension in her chest ease for the first time since her capture. Yet something else grew in its place, a quiet confusion. How could kindness exist here in a place built for punishment? One evening, as the sun dissolved behind the mountains, Hayes joined the lumberjacks by the fire. They were telling stories, some true, most exaggerated. Hargrove, with his arms still bandaged, laughed loudly and said, "That little nurse has got more courage than half the army." The men nodded, raising their cups. Hayes didn't laugh. He looked toward the barracks, where the faint silhouette of Aiko moved behind the curtain, and said quietly, "War makes fools of all of us. Maybe she just remembered we're still people." Inside, Aiko couldn't sleep. The carved fox sat on the windowsill, catching the firelight from outside. She didn't understand what she felt. It wasn't gratitude alone. It was something heavier, like guilt disguised as warmth. She thought of the men who had died under her care, the soldiers whose faces still visited her dreams. She thought of Hargrove's blood on her hands that morning and how human it had looked, no different from anyone else's. By the end of the month, the routine had settled again. The fires were gone, the machines repaired, and the air grew colder. But the silence between captors and captives was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of people learning how to coexist. A strange peace had descended, fragile but real. The Japanese women began humming old folk songs while they worked. Sometimes the lumberjacks would tap their boots in rhythm, pretending not to listen. One day, as the first leaves turned gold, Hayes stopped Aiko outside the shed. "You've done good work here," he said through the interpreter. "When the war ends, you'll go home." She met his gaze, unflinching this time. "And you?" she asked. He paused before answering. "Home's not a place anymore. It's just the part of you that didn't get lost." She didn't fully understand his meaning, but the tone lingered in her mind long after he walked away. That night, the northern lights shimmered across the sky, painting green fire over the camp. The prisoners stood outside, breathless, whispering prayers. The lumberjacks watched from their own side of the fence. No one spoke, yet for that brief hour there was no war, no victors, no captives, only the hum of wonder in the frozen air. Aiko held the wooden fox close to her chest, her heart beating fast, not from fear but from something achingly human. She looked toward the men by the fire, their faces lit in emerald light, and realized the truth she had been avoiding. The giants were not made of muscle and size alone. Their strength came from something quieter, something she was only beginning to understand. And though she didn't know it yet, the winter ahead would test that strength in ways none of them could imagine. By late November, the world around Camp Wrangell turned white. Snow came not as gentle flakes but as walls of wind-driven powder that erased the horizon and buried memory itself. The forest, once alive with the sound of axes and laughter, now lay still, its trees bowed under the crushing weight of ice. 4 days, the lumberjacks fought against it, cutting new paths through the snow, repairing roofs, rationing wood, but Alaska was a rival no human could truly defeat. The Japanese women huddled in their barracks, the air so cold their breath froze on their blankets. Each morning, Aiko woke to find frost blooming across the window like a ghostly garden. She rubbed her hands together until they stung, whispering a prayer that the storm would break before it broke them. Sergeant Hayes was everywhere at once, checking the generator, clearing paths, shouting orders through the howling wind. His face was drawn, the color drained from his lips. He knew the camp wasn't built for this kind of winter. "Keep the stoves burning," he told the women through the interpreter. "If the pipes freeze, you'll lose your water. If the water freezes, you'll lose your chance to survive." His words carried no threat, only grim certainty. Aiko nodded, clutching her coat tighter. Reiko coughed beside her, the sound thin and brittle. By the second week, the temperature dropped below -30. The barracks creaked under the snow's weight, wood moaning like something alive. Food supplies ran low. The lumberjacks rationed coffee, the prisoners stretched rice with melted snow. Even laughter vanished. Only the wind spoke now, shrieking through every crack and gap. When the generator failed one night, darkness swallowed the camp whole. The silence that followed was so deep it felt like the earth had stopped breathing. Hayes gathered the men near the fire pit. "If the roofs don't hold, we lose them," he said simply. "And if we lose them, we'll lose ourselves next." No one argued. The lumberjacks weren't soldiers anymore. They were men of the land, bound by an unspoken code of responsibility. Bill Hargrove, his red beard thick with frost, grunted, "Guess it's time the giants earn their keep." They lit torches and pushed into the storm. Iko was half asleep when the wall cracked. The sound was sudden, a loud, splintering snap, followed by the weight of snow crashing through the ceiling. Screams filled the room. She rolled off her bunk, instinct driving her to shield Reiko. Snow poured in, freezing her hands to the touch. "Help!" someone shouted in Japanese. Then another voice, muffled, answered in English, "Hold on." She looked up and saw shadows in the doorway, men, enormous shapes moving through the white chaos. Torches flared, casting golden halos through the storm. Hayes led them, his shoulders hunched against the wind, eyes burning with focus. "Get them out," he shouted. "Now." The next minutes were a blur of motion and cold. Hargrove swung his axe like a hammer, breaking open a blocked exit. The beam of the doorway cracked and light burst through. Iko felt strong arms lift her before she could protest. Hayes carried her and Reiko together, one under each arm, through knee-deep snow toward the mess hall. She could feel his heart pounding through his coat, each step deliberate, heavy, unstoppable. When they reached the shelter, he set them down gently near the fire. "You're safe," he said, voice hoarse. His breath steamed in the air like smoke from a furnace. Inside the mess hall was chaos. Dozens of shivering women wrapped in blankets, their faces pale, eyes glassy with shock. The stove blazed at full heat, men feeding it with logs as fast as they could split them. Someone passed around mugs of steaming coffee, others handed out coats. The language barrier no longer mattered. Gestures and glances spoke enough. Iko sat on the floor, trembling uncontrollably. When Hayes knelt beside her and checked her hands for frostbite, she flinched. "You'll live," he said quietly, as if reassuring himself. She managed a nod. "Why?" she whispered. The interpreter looked confused, but Hayes understood anyway. "Because that's what people do," he said. Hours passed. Outside, the storm roared on, indifferent to courage or compassion. But inside that hall, a fragile warmth began to take hold. The lumberjacks took turns keeping the fire alive, their huge shadows dancing on the walls. Reiko leaned her head on Iko's shoulder, half asleep, whispering, "They saved us." Iko stared into the flames and murmured, "Maybe they saved themselves too." When dawn finally came, the world outside looked reborn. The storm had stopped, leaving behind silence so pure it hurt to breathe. The camp was buried under snow up to the roofs, yet no one had died. Hayes and his men walked the perimeter, inspecting the damage. Every movement looked slower now, heavier. The men's faces were drawn but calm. Survival had stitched them together more tightly than orders ever could. Later that day, when the women ventured out, they saw something that would stay with them for life. The giants of Alaska, men they had once feared, were hauling wood to rebuild the broken barracks. Hayes stood in the snow, sleeves rolled up, swinging an axe with mechanical precision. Each strike sent chips flying, steam rising from his skin in the cold air. Iko watched in silence. Something inside her shifted again. She had seen men die for war. Now she was watching men live for mercy. Hargrove spotted her standing nearby and called out, "You holding up, nurse?" She blinked, surprised he remembered her role. He grinned, teeth white against his beard. "You saved my hide once. Consider this payback." She tried to smile but couldn't. Instead, she bowed, a gesture he didn't fully understand but returned anyway, tipping his hat. That evening, as the rebuilt roof was finished, Hayes ordered a small meal prepared for everyone, guards, lumberjacks, and prisoners alike. It was simple: bread, beans, and coffee. Yet the atmosphere felt sacred. The interpreter struggled to keep up as both sides tried to speak, exchanging halting words of gratitude and disbelief. One woman offered Hayes a small origami crane folded from the corner of a ration label. He stared at it for a long time before setting it gently on the table, saying, "You keep it. We'll need you to teach us how to make one when this is all over." The hall erupted in quiet laughter. When night fell, Aiko sat by the fire's edge, staring at the carved wooden fox on her lap. Its surface was smooth now from the heat of her hands. Hayes walked past, pausing just long enough to ask, "You warm enough?" She looked up, meeting his eyes. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, then turned toward the door. Just before he stepped outside, she spoke again, softly in broken English. "Thank you, Giant." He froze for half a heartbeat, then smiled. "You're welcome, nurse." The door closed behind him with a whisper, letting in a brief gust of snow before sealing the warmth in. Outside, the moon glowed over the frozen trees. The forest, once a battlefield between man and nature, now stood quiet, humbled by what it had witnessed. Inside, the fire burned steadily, the sound of crackling wood mixing with the slow, steady breathing of the survivors. For that single night, there were no sides, no prisoners, no guards, no victors. Only people who had faced the same storm and chosen to pull one another from the snow instead of letting them die in it. Aiko lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the wind calm against the roof. For the first time since the war began, she didn't dream of home or of fear. She dreamed of the firelight, of rough hands that didn't strike, of a kindness that had no name. When she finally drifted off, the storm had already passed, but its echo, the memory of giants moving through snow, would stay with her forever. By May of 1946, the ice had finally loosened its grip on the valley. The rivers broke their silence, rushing through the forest like veins waking after a long sleep. The air still held a chill, but sunlight spilled across Camp Wrangell, golden and clean, melting what was left of winter's cruelty. For the first time in months, laughter carried through the camp again, hesitant, almost fragile. Yet beneath that fragile peace was something heavier, something none of them wanted to name. The end was coming. Orders had arrived from the mainland. The Japanese prisoners were to be repatriated. Aiko read the announcement on the notice board, the English letters meaningless until the interpreter explained. She didn't speak. Around her, the other women whispered in disbelief. Some smiled faintly, already imagining the docks of Yokohama, the faces of family they weren't sure still existed. But Aiko felt only an emptiness she couldn't explain. The word home had become strange to her, an idea blurred by snow and sawdust and the sound of axes in the morning. Reiko clasped her hand that evening. "We should be happy," she whispered. "It's over." Aiko nodded, but her chest ached. "Yes," she said. "Over." Yet she knew that some endings felt more like loss than victory. Outside, the men were packing equipment, hauling lumber for the last time. The sound of hammers echoed through the clearing. Hayes stood by the storage shed, clipboard in hand, his face unreadable. He had known this would happen eventually. War ended and people went home. But this felt different. It felt like dismantling something human they had accidentally built. A few nights later, as the camp gathered for what would be their final shared meal, the air carried a quiet solemnity. Long tables were set inside the mess hall, candles flickering despite the lingering daylight. The lumberjacks sat alongside the women, an arrangement that months ago would have been unthinkable. Bread, stew, and coffee again, but this time no one hurried. Every movement seemed deliberate, a way to delay the inevitable. Hargrove lifted his mug. "To the end of a damn cold winter," he said gruffly. Laughter rippled around the room, soft and genuine. Hayes raised his own cup and added, "And to the ones who faced it with us." When the meal ended, no one stood to leave. Instead, stories began, fragments of memory shared across the divide of language. One woman recited a poem from Kyoto, and though few understood the words, the rhythm of her voice drew quiet tears from the men. Hargrove responded by playing a battered harmonica, the melancholy tune slipping between the walls like wind through pine. Aiko sat near the fire, her gaze fixed on the glow. Hayes was beside her, silent, watching the flames. She turned slightly, breaking the rule she had once vowed to keep. "Do you have someone waiting for you?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. "Not anymore," he said. "The war took most of what I had. My brother, my wife, even the way I used to see the world." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "And you?" She thought for a long moment before answering. "My home is gone," she said. "Bombs took it. But I think I found something here I didn't know I was looking for." Hayes met her gaze then, and for a heartbeat, neither of them blinked. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was sacred, as if words might break the fragile bridge between them. The next morning came heavy with fog. The ship from Anchorage would arrive by noon. The women packed what little they had, scraps of letters, small carvings, trinkets traded for work. Aiko placed the wooden fox carefully inside her satchel, wrapping it in cloth. Reiko watched her with a bittersweet smile. "You'll show them that back home?" she asked. "Maybe," Aiko said. "Or maybe I'll leave it here where it belongs." Outside, the men stood in formation near the dock. The giants looked smaller now, their axes replaced by quiet hands hanging at their sides. Hayes waited at the front, coat buttoned, hat low. When the women approached, conversation faded. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Hargrove stepped forward and handed Aiko a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Something to remember Alaska by," he muttered. Inside was a hand-carved cup, smoothed with oil. She bowed deeply, unable to speak. He only nodded, his eyes damp in the cold air. The interpreter called out the names one by one. The women began boarding, their feet echoing against the wooden planks. Aiko lingered at the end of the line. She turned once more to look at the camp, the cabins, the sawmill, the smoke curling from chimneys she had once despised. It looked peaceful now, like a place that belonged to another life. She saw Hayes standing apart, his expression unreadable, one hand resting on the fence post. The wind lifted his coat, the same coat he had given her that night of the blizzard. Without thinking, she stepped away from the line. Reiko hissed her name, but Aiko kept walking until she stood a few feet from him. "You never said goodbye," she said quietly. Hayes hesitated, then removed his hat. "Didn't seem right," he replied. "Goodbyes make things too real." She smiled faintly. "Then don't say it." He looked at her for a long time, memorizing every line of her face. "You'll do fine out there," he said. "You've got more strength than most men I know." She wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that strength had never been hers alone, but before she could, the ship's horn wailed across the bay. It was time. She took a step back but then stopped. Slowly, she reached into her satchel and pulled out the wooden fox. "It belongs here," she said, holding it out. "It was made from this land." Hayes took it carefully, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, electric, final. He nodded once, the motion slow and deliberate. "I'll keep it safe," he said, "till the snow falls again." As Aiko turned to leave, the wind carried a sound behind her, metal striking metal. She looked back to see the lumberjacks raising their axes high in the air, the gesture solemn, almost ceremonial. Hayes lifted his as well, the steel catching the sunlight. It wasn't a salute of soldiers but of equals, people who had survived the same storm and recognized the same humanity in each other. Tears blurred her vision as she stepped onto the ship. The ramp lifted, the engines growled to life, and the shoreline began to recede. She stood at the railing watching the camp shrink into the mist. For a moment, It looked like a toy village carved from ice. The men grew smaller until they were just shapes against the white. Then even those shapes disappeared, swallowed by fog and distance. Reiko touched her shoulder gently. "You're crying," she said. Aiko smiled through her tears. "No," she whispered. "I'm remembering." Hours later, as the ship turned south toward the open sea, the sky broke open with color. The northern lights shimmered one last time, green and violet ribbons undulating across the heavens. The women gasped, but Aiko only watched in silence. Somewhere back in that frozen valley, a man was probably standing at the edge of the forest, holding a small wooden fox under the same light. For the first time in years she felt no hatred, no fear, only the quiet certainty that the world, even after war, still had room for grace. The ship's horn sounded again, long and low, echoing into the endless cold. Aiko closed her eyes and let the wind wash over her face. When she opened them, the stars had begun to appear, bright and clean. The giants of Alaska were gone now, but the memory of their strength, their gentleness, would follow her across every sea. And as the darkness settled, she whispered to herself, not a prayer, not a farewell, but a promise. "I will remember the day mercy wore a giant's hands."